So then we are back with more understandings from the time of the Second Tabernacle services, and the translation used is then the Aramaic English translation of the word. This translation is from the original manuscripts of the prophets of Yahweh, from the prophets of Israel, and then they indicate for us via prophecies the time of the end, so then we can position ourselves and we can understand this factor. The task of unveiling or galaying has befallen upon us Americans, because we are then the very nation that can handle such a task. And starting then from the prophet Mashiyach, known as Isaiah, the 61st chapter, we find then the first clearing of the entire religious basis from the scripture. And then there is a saying very famous in American land where we find the American people can handle the truth as long as they are not lied to. So then here we are then facing ourselves with the truth, and let's try to handle it the best we can, and then clearing up the entire system of religion, where we can then gradually begin our quest in then galaying or revealing the truth of the scripture. So from the 61st chapter we find then Mashiyach many years ago, roughly 500 years prior of the Mashiyach, explaining then the time of restoration from an existing time of his period where then not even the spring feast was completed. So it was a very difficult task for Mashiyach then explaining the time of restoration where not even the spring feast was completed. The nation was in trouble. There was a lot of political upheavals at the time, and there was Mashiyach, the great prophet, explaining great understandings of the scripture, and nobody was listening to him. In fact, back then there was the Sanhedrin, or then the 70 elders from the time of Moshe, and they would take notes of the people from the outside to make sure they were speaking properly the words of the Creator, and Mashiyach was one of them. Very important prophet, as we read his prophecies today. And then we begin our quest in then revealing to the world, because we are the nation, in fact, with the most spotlight at and on, in fact. And then we have this task of at least revealing these truths to the world. And though sometimes does not make us very happy, for sure, but then we have this task, and it must be done as we were then granted the truth of the scripture. And then let's try clean up some of the junk that we have learned for a period of 1,000 years, not only the time of our nation, but prior of our own nation, because we were born, and this nation was in fact born during the time of deceit, was in the 1700s. And then we find lots of work to do, at least in indicating what's truly coming in the future. So then Mashiyach, known as Isaiah, when we read Mashiyach explaining the prophecy during the time where then not even the spring feast was completed yet, the people thought that he was crazy. But however, we read it today, what it meant of the holy cities, and then we find very clearly he was not crazy, and he knew what he was talking about. But he was in a dimension that we can't explain these days, because he was truly in a layer of heaven. He was found then sometimes in a temple, and he saw many visions there, and he spoke words that were not even recorded. For instance, the word of tabernacling in Hebrew of the Second Tabernacle services, we don't even know the word, because though Mashiyach spoke, it wasn't recorded because it did not make any sense. So there is a lot of research that must be done through the scripture, because we are finding from Hebrews 7:12 there is then a change of the priestlyhood, so there is also a change in instruction. This meant it wasn't a change of replacement, but a completion of from the first in order to start the second. So then we begin to realize whatsoever then the first tabernacle service has taught, we have to complete. So the words used in Hebrew regarding the first service, you have to complete the words related with the tabernacle for the second. So those are not new words. They are the same words but then completed. For instance, first tabernacle service, you understand the laws, then mitzvahim, but then related with the second tabernacle services. Mitzvahim, or then a completion of this word related with the Mashiyach. So then, we find ourselves then, we learned many areas of the scripture during the time where then those people in leadership were deceived. They did not have a clue what they were talking about. Unfortunately, we find the truth from Shaul, where he said at the end of time they would concoct for themselves teachers teaching what they don't understand. And then we find ourselves then being confronted with the truth, and sometimes does not make us very happy, does it? But does it change the prophecy? Certainly doesn't. Should we abandon then the word of the Creator because we are unhappy by explaining these truths? No, we have to go on with it. As soldiers of the Mashiyach, we must explain these areas, and the changes must be done. And then we understand the first area of these new period of restoration is related with the set apart, and then focusing upon the Ishmaelic lineage, because the Creator then is rescuing the firstborn of Abraham to include these people in his family. And this is going to be crucial for then the building of the third temple when the time comes. So the Gentiles, they don't have a very big task regarding this time of restoration, other than those who are enlightened then to unveil to other people what the true meaning of the scriptures are. Or then, because you find many of these understandings are compounded in a single understanding of the tabernacle, but then the tabernacle is related with many areas of the scripture. So then we find this time a time of encouragement of the set apart from the lineage of the Hebraic people. Some of them, not every of them, only some of them are going to be enlightened at first, and obviously we should never force this new revealing to any person of the set apart if they do not want to listen it. Because some of them are going to respond, some of them won't. But we understand that the removing of the blindness from Israel is going to start gradually. It's not a situation where as a lightning bolt comes and the whole nation then is enlightened. It doesn't happen that way. Only first a few people, they get enlightened, and then they have to kind of study a bit and understand what it meant. Then obviously later more people are going to come to the truth until the blindness is then removed. But then we have to understand also where it is going to be the first holy city of the time of restoration, as we can read. Mashiyach then 18th gives us then the geographical area where the first holy city is going to be at. Because of the special Hebrew word tabernacling, ing, what this word means is the continuation. The word of the Creator is a continuous or continuing word. That's why when you read Mashiyach, the 18th chapter, you find tabernacling, because it's a continuation from the first and the second in the same word. However, when you read this in Hebrew, during the time of Mashiyach, they did not understand what he meant. So they used then a cipher word, yushkni. There is no meaning for this word, because you have to understand the context of the scripture, of the text, to make sense the cipher word. Mashiyach spoke the word, but then an enlightenment from the translator, when he began to translate the understanding, for Ruach HaKodesh gave a hint, tabernacling. Because it is the continuation of what the Mashiyach had started from the time of his father. So tabernacling amongst the fierce, long-limbed people, we understand, is going to be in the land of Cush, or the previous kingdom of Nubia. How is it going to take place? Only the Creator knows. The task is informing the people that there is then the unveiling of the revelation, and then is a time of the rescue of the firstborn of Abraham. We don't determine those areas, but the Creator does. He gave already a lot of time for His people to do the work, and then comes a time where we find ourselves reading sections of the Galah or Revelation where the temple then obviously was rebuilt, but then we have to understand then during this time the Muslims, they hold then the Temple Mount. They have then the authority over there. And there is a reason for it, because then the Ishmaelites from the firstborn of Abraham, they're going to be brought in the family. How is that going to take place? Only the Creator knows. But we understand the scriptures then, they are being revealed to us, and we are informing them of these new changes. And truly they are not changes, they are only revealings. But then these revealings, they change the way people think, because they were never exposed to the truth before. As Shaliach Shaul, then known as Paul, said at the end, people would have a mind as seared with a hot iron, where they could not endure sound doctrine. And these are then sound doctrines from the original manuscripts, where people then they get startled, because they never heard this before. But of course, they were born during the time where deceit was rampant. They were born during the time of deceit, with a deceitful scripture, and they could not make any sense out of it. Ask them, what do you understand of Revelation? They can't explain it, because their God is blind. However, those who are enlightened from the scripture, they understand Revelation. It's not complicated. In fact, it's fairly simple when you understand the content of the original manuscripts, but you have to be enlightened. Then the Mashiyach explained the spring feast, and he explained then the autumn feast, and then Yohanan, the most important author of the spring feast. It's not Mashiyach. Though Mashiyach has his importance for being a Levite, and then you link Mashiyach with the Hebrews, because those are related with the tabernacle services. So Yohanan comes first, because Yohanan was on a Mount Gerizim with Mashiyach, when he was then approved by Moshe and Eliyahu. That's why we read first Yohanan. It is the utmost importance understanding the chronological area of the spring feast from the tabernacle's viewpoint, not from events chronological periods. If you do by chronological events during the spring feast, then you lose the sight of the tabernacle focus. We must start first with tabernacle focus, because then in Hebrews, when you read, always tabernacle is the focus. So then we start with tabernacle. Then the rest of details then is ramified, or the ramifications from the tabernacle comes the other details. Then we position ourselves properly and our minds are trained then to understanding layers. If we try to do chronological events, every time is a burden. Reading the scripture becomes a burden because you have to know then the events per each situation taking place in the scripture, and that makes it extremely complex. When you have the tabernacle as the focus, then the other areas, they fall into place much easier. That's why understanding the spring feast must be in tabernacle or tabernacling perspective. So we start then with Yohanan, because Yohanan was then a Mashiyach or apostle. He was with the Mashiyach during the 490 days of his ministry. He was up there on the Mount Gerizim with the Mashiyach, Eliyahu, and Moshe, plus Shimon and Yaakov. He saw the transfiguration of the Mashiyach as the living Torah, living tabernacle. Why was he on Mount Gerizim? Because the tabernacle had to move out from Jerusalem, indicating then the Mashiyach going around the world and then saving the Gentiles. But the Gentiles would not be saved first, but then his people would be then delegated responsibilities. Then they would cluster, form holy cities, and then the Gentiles would be saved. Though there were Gentiles saved during the time of a transition. So then, with this whole shebang of truth, then we must position ourselves and learn more of what had taken place from Tabernacle's viewpoint. So then there are areas where we have to match up, pair up the layers of understandings of the spring feast. For instance, there are areas of Yohanan where we compare with Mashiyach. They complete each other of the same event. As long as we understand of the tabernacle reference, then there are layers from Yohanan, layers from Mashiyach. Obviously, when you pair those, you have to find another layer in Hebrew. And you find then another layer in Luke, and another layer then in Mark. But Luke and Mark must be left aside at the very last, because they were Gentiles. You can't start reading Gentile records prior of first understanding Yohanan and then a Levite. Yohanan, because he was on the top of Mount Gerizim with the Mashiyach while he was transfigured, he saw firsthand the Mashiyach as the living Torah during the second tabernacle services, the most important. Then you filter it through a Levite related with tabernacle. As you filter at the end, then the Gentiles records. Obviously, because you're going to find a lot of mistakes from the Gentiles recording of the spring feast. And then later we understand then the Galah or revelation. So then when you read Yohanan related with Mount of Transfiguration, Mount Gerizim, you understand you have a layer from Mashiyach, you have a layer then from Hebrews, and you have the 50th chapter of Revelation. At least these you have to read at the same time, because they are related with the same event. So you read then Yohanan, the story of the Mashiyach then coming to ask for a drink at the well. You find a lady over there, and she said the well is deep. You can get water over there, but she draw water very often, and she drew water for him. And then he explained her life. Then he was invited to the city, and then he was received with joy, as it was part of the spring feast. Then he went up to the mountain, and there he transfigured himself. Then up there you have to then pair up with Mashiyach, the first gospel, and then Hebrews, and then Revelation, because he was opening the seals. Then when he comes down from the mountain, he has the objective of becoming the Redemptor. He already had then opened the seals and indicated what's coming next is then the autumn feast. But then himself, as his personal task, was to become a Redemptor. Then he goes to Jerusalem, and then he is placed on a pole. So these are the events related with the tabernacling. We start directly with the tabernacle. We don't start with his genealogy, where he comes from, though it's important. But we start directly with the tabernacle. We are objective and very clear and clean. Started with Yohanan, then on Mount Gerizim. That's where you find the first tabernacle outside of the first tabernacle service. Then from there is a smooth sailing. It doesn't take much for you to understand the rest of it, as long as you understand pairing up the similitudes per each of those gospels except Luke and Mark. Don't read Luke and Mark until the end. Pair up first with Yohanan as the reference point, then Mashiyach because he is a Levite. Then find references in Hebrews, then find references then in Galah or Revelation. Then you start filtering through, and then at the end, whatsoever is left of the details of the events, then you read Luke and Mark, because those were Gentiles. Sometimes you read in Luke and Mark, and there was then the feast of the Jews or feast of the Hebrews. So he's speaking in the third person. Does not even make sense. So don't even read it until the end. Though then it takes some practice to get these done, at least you understand the truth the way then the prophets and the Shlishim, they did understand the scripture. And this is what is valid, because if you can't explain Revelation, then your God is blind. You can't come up with an excuse saying, oh, because God made Revelation confusing, then to confuse the devil. But are you the devil? Should you be confused as the devil is confused? Because if you are confused, you don't understand Revelation, and you think the Creator has managed Revelation to be so confusing that the devil doesn't understand, but do you understand yourselves? You have to understand yourselves then to beat the devil. You have to understand the scripture, understand Revelation, so then you can teach other people. So other people, they get glad or revealed with what's coming in the future. And granted, sometimes does not make you very happy, because every time you begin to study the scripture from the original manuscript, you get attacked. It's true, but it's the price of studying the Holy Scripture. But then as you begin, then don't blame anybody else, but then you begin study with those people who are enlightened in teaching properly in layer, then you don't have to guess very often. You are given direct answers, and then your data gets locked in place. Then your mind doesn't get floating around, as so many pastors, teachers, evangelists, they are teaching for more than 30 years and they don't know what they are talking about. It's extremely ridiculous watching a television program or then listening to shortwave radio, these people talking junk. They are concocted for themselves only teachers of their own. Even if they hear themselves speaking, makes no sense. They take a piece of the gospel, a piece of the prophets, a piece sometimes of the Torah, and they use it for their own gain. The Mashiyach is not for this kind of attitude. He is for those people that do understand the Torah for what it is. And then they teach as such, and then they gala, or they reveal to others what it means, and let then the Creator taking them on from what they have then understood and onwards, and be a backup for those people, because they are going to have a lot of questions. Because a lot of people, they are truly seriously studying the scripture, but they were never given the first start. They were taught of this Mashiyach outside of the Holy Tabernacles. So then you begin a whole series of understandings from a point that is a fable. You are given a Mashiyach outside of the Holy Tabernacles, then how are you going to understand the rest of it? So you are given the wrong Mashiyach. So then you have to understand yourself, the Mashiyach that you learned was then wrong. Then you begin to understand the Mashiyach from Yohanan, the 4th chapter. Or then other areas of Yohanan where you find the Mashiyach. Primarily during the time he was then at Mount Gerizim, where then you find the Mashiyach then starting his Holy Tabernacles. And these should be then discussed then during the time of study of the scripture, during the time of the gatherings. This should be discussed, because this is the very core of what the Mashiyach wants them to learn. And then granted, 1,000 years of the city was respected. So since then the time of restoration is being implemented, it must be respected. So your effort in understanding the Holy Scripture is going to be then respected. However, expect a combat in the spirit, or spiritual combat, because as you understand the scripture and enlighten other people, obviously they are going to have questions. But then make a list of those people that can back you up in terms of explaining to you what the scriptures mean from the enlightenment of the tabernacles. So then we can walk yourself through what the Mashiyach has taught, and then you can understand revelation. So many people, they simply don't understand, and they think no person in the earth can understand it. That's not true. Revelation is very simple, but as long as a person doesn't understand in layers and then a tabernacle focused, then they won't understand, because it's a form of protection of the scripture. If you start then with a pagan understanding of the scripture, you ended up with a pagan understanding of the scripture, meaning confusion. But when you are given the first start then with the scripture from the tabernacle's viewpoint, then you have to learn the tabernacle's viewpoint and teach other people. So please stay tuned, much more coming up.